Good evening, good evening. I'm Duncan McRae. I'm an associate professor of ancient Greek and Roman studies. I'm the co-director of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, and most relevantly right now, I'm a faculty affiliate of the Center for Jewish Studies, which is presenting this talk. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Professor Hindy Najman. Professor Najman is a preeminent scholar of Jewish literature in the Second Temple period. That means, for those uninitiated perhaps, that she's a leading interpreter of texts that range from the canonical Hebrew Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls to the rich library of Greek Jewish literature and many other texts that are now transmitted in Syriac, Ge'ez, and sometimes even Latin. We're really fortunate to have her here with us in Berkeley. It's impossible to do justice to a scholar of Professor Najman's standing in such a short introduction. I will just give a précis. Professor Najman was educated at the Yeshiva University and at Harvard. It's a good institution. She taught at Notre Dame, Toronto, Yale, and now she teaches at Oxford, Oriel College, Oxford, where she is the Oriel and Lang Professor of the Interpretation of Holy Scripture. The name of her professorship, I understand, goes back to the 19th century, but I think it's wonderfully appropriate. It could have been chosen for her, given how appropriate it is to her work. Over 4 books, 18 edited collections, and articles and essays beyond count, Professor Najman has put the spotlight on interpretation in Second Temple literature as a generative practice. Indeed, as I think, a prime source for new literary production. Rather than set aside hermeneutic, pseudepigraphical, and apocalyptic literature as marginal, she shows how it can offer us a truly valuable view of ancient Jewish thinking about textual authority and performance. At the same time, she doesn't abstract literary production from the lives of Jewish communities. Her work is particularly attentive to the relationship between literature and collective trauma, particularly the dislocations involved in both the Babylonian exile and the fall of the Second Temple in 70. And her work is very alive to the role of reading and writing in Jewish formations of the self. These contributions, there's too much to talk about, so I decided to focus on my favorite thing. And I don't know whether I picked the right thing, but these contributions, I think, are brilliantly exemplified in her third book, Losing the Temple and Recovering the Future, an analysis of 4 Ezra, which was published in 2014. In that book, she considers how 4 Ezra, an apocalyptic text from the late 1st century CE, reboots the figure of Ezra the scribe as an inspired prophet to work through the traumatic loss of the temple. But it's no narrow exegesis. The idea of a reboot is borrowed, I think memorably, at least it has stuck with me, from 1980s comic books, particularly John Byrne's reboot of the character Superman as Man of Steel. But just as impressively and much more poignantly, Professor Najman also pursues a comparison of 4 Ezra with the radical hope of Crow-Indian leader Plenty Coups in the face of US destruction of traditional indigenous ways on the Great Plains. Ultimately, she argues, 4 Ezra offers the reader a paired responsibility to look to a divinely authored future and to lament the destruction of the present. Before I go into the very details of today's lecture, I should also say, Professor, and this is why I'm so excited that she's here, Professor Najman is unbelievably committed to a profound conversation between biblical studies and Second Temple Jewish literature and classical literature, Greek and Latin literature. I think that's one of the reasons her work is so exciting and important. And so it's just a real piece of good fortune that she's here. Professor Najman's most recent book is Scriptural Vitality, Rethinking Philology and Hermeneutics, which I've just put away in my bag, but you have to imagine it here. It's just been published this year by OUP. I think we're about to hear a bit more about that work in a moment. So, with that in mind, please welcome Professor Hindy Najman for her lecture, Scriptural Vitality and the Shaping of Jewish Tradition. I'm going to pass around the book so everybody will have a glimpse
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here, also to be introduced by a Latinist, by a classicist, and to think about scriptural vitality in conversation with you, Duncan. It's really so wonderful. I really can't begin my talk here without thinking about the legacy of Berkeley and how inspiring it is for me to be here, and the ways in which I won't name everyone, but I'll name a few people that have really shaped my thinking and have really inspired my work, even already as an undergraduate. So Robert Alter's work has a lot to do with why I'm in this field in the first place. The project I'm describing is very much a product of an ongoing argument, but the kind of argument of friends between myself and Ron Hendel about how to think about originary moments and textual criticism, the ethics of textual criticism. I think one of my first teachers, really through reading, although I never studied with him, is Daniel Boyarin, and my ongoing thinking about intertextuality, of course, is marked and shaped and inspired by his deep engagement with literary theory, which I think was exemplary from the very beginning, and really set new paradigms for us. And I feel like I'm always just trying to catch up with him, which is virtually impossible. And I think, and of course, Hannah Bloch's very, very beautiful translations. This entire book means to be a kind of meditative poetry, to enable these texts from Jewish antiquity to sing again. But before I finish, I do want to just take a moment. My third book, Losing the Temple, Recovering the Future, was very much an intimate conversation with Jonathan Lear. And there's a little footnote to Psalm 137, Al Naharot Bavel, by the waters of Babylon, in that book. And we spent a lot of time talking about hermeneutics and therapy and healing after destruction. And we just lost him. So the world is a little bit less light. He just passed away a few days ago. And your mentioning of Jonathan Lear made me feel like I want to dedicate the lecture to the memory of Jonathan Lear and to his legacy, and to the way in which he's helped us think about radical hope, perhaps the most important today in the world in which we live. So, okay. One of the central themes of the book, Scriptural Vitality, is the importance of reconsidering the Hellenistic period as one of the most important and formative periods for the history of Judaism. I mean, it's an obvious fact, right? We understand the Babylonian and the Persian periods to be incredibly important for the formation of kind of the mythological and the literary context, and historical context and political context for the production of the Hebrew Bible, but so too is the Hellenistic period. And it's to this end that I employ the language of vitality. By this, I intend to signal a transformative and life-giving dynamic to a Judaism that continued to configure itself and its texts over time, and in the face of great loss and the threat of destruction. This dynamic and resilient nature is exemplified in a whole host of texts across the Second Temple period, a period which encompasses, of course, both the Persian and Hellenistic periods, but which also has profound implications for the historiography of Judaism, or Wissenschaft des Judentums. My claim runs counter to the long-standing idea that Second Temple Judaism is late Judaism, or in the German Spätjudentum. And this has often been replaced by Frühjudentum, early Judaism. But I would argue that the underlying attitude expressed by the term Spätjudentum is still detectable, late Judaism, and the prolific productivity of the Second Temple period has not been adequately acknowledged for the impact and the importance for the history of Judaism. I argue against some lines of current thinking in the field of ancient Judaism and biblical studies, problematizing the search for the originary moment. And here I argue that the reconstruction of an original archetype like an original pre-form of a text, is not the only or even the best way to study the history of the development of the text. I problematize the search for the original moment because it can obscure the compositional history of a work that is not singular or rather pluriform. And here, someone I didn't mention, Jim Porter, who's also here in Berkeley, is someone I've been thinking with around Nietzsche's critique of the history of classics for many, many years. And I've tried to put our text in conversation with that, going back to a series of articles on Wolff and Eichhorn, kind of the origin or the birth of philology for ancient Judaism and classics. In any event, this is relevant for all sorts of texts. The Kaddish, the mourner's Kaddish, the Haggadah, Perek Shirah that Sholem wrote on, and many, many more texts. I'm going to return to this matter of pluriformity later on in the talk. I also want to reconsider compositional practices. So on the one hand, and I always say this to my students, we express critique, but then we need an alternative, right? We need to talk about what else we can do, not just to break things down, as Jeremiah says, but also to build things up. So I express critique of the need to reconstruct something prior or original, as if that pretext or prior text redeems or gives us privileged information about the first or original moment. In addition to original moments, we can also consider the growth and development of textual traditions as part of the very fabric and essence of the text under critical evaluation. Thus, it's not only about finding tensions and ruptures in a text, but rather it's also about reconstructing the conversation of compositional practices over time. Texts, ancient and modern, have complex histories and interactions within traditions as they are embedded within a single work. A single work, of course, that has its own history that grows over time. My alternative is part of what my next book project is on, which is pluriformity in poetry. I'll gesture towards that towards the end of my paper, but a new project entitled Pluriformity, where I think about pluriform instead of monoform as an alternative framework. There are many, many different ways in which this looks. And whatever example you're going to put on the table, whether it's Mishnah and Tosefta, whether it's the traditions of Esther, whether it's the growth of the Danielic tradition, there are many, many different forms to what this pluriformity can look like. But pluriformity is not only an account of the extant forms of the text, but it's also it's a characterization of how textual traditions can originate and transform over time. Furthermore, variation can express the development of scribal thought processes and the integration of textual traditions. So the tension between regulation and production. This is something that Simon Goldhill has thought about a lot in his Traditions on Reception. So here we can see how pluriformity works between regulation and production, but also what's at stake in that moment. And I'm thinking about how the moment of new pluriformity arises in tandem with emerging fixity. Rewriting then can perhaps be understood as an integration of the monoform and the polyform. So there's an ongoing tension between regulation and production. Time doesn't permit me to really develop many examples, but one example that I have in mind is very much the Septuagint, the Greek Bible, different versions. And on the one hand, someone like Philo of Alexandria will talk about the monoform and the correct form, but we know that there are many forms of these Greek translations that are floating about. Again, we can also come back to any of these things during the Q&A. Traditionary processes, ongoing openness, compositional hermeneutics. So these are all the ways in which I'm thinking with the history of textuality. To talk about compositional practices, it's really deceptive to think that what we're doing is talking about early first millennium. I mean, yes, also ancient Israel, but it's also the history of the texts as we have them. And here I'm really gesturing towards the history of the manuscript tradition, the physical form of material philology. Here's a little bit of fun. This is from Marcello Fidencio, who's reconstructing parts of the Isaiah scroll. So reading practices, and here you can see, look at this, see? You can see correction, you can see assembly. We're going to talk about this in a little bit. You can see marks of correction. You can see scribal overflow of lines. Reading practices are about understanding the interrelational dimensions of a work, not only a work of the past, but also one that continually revitalizes itself through internal conversation as a read and interpreted text. To understand the construction of the text is then to understand its own poiesis within each iteration and across its pluriform manifestations. Another dimension to this book, and also my general interest in textuality, is about the author function and authorizing practices. What constitutes an authentic work, then, is an important part of my thinking, but also about ongoing research. I challenge forgery, as I have even from my very, very first monograph, as a category that reifies what is authentic and pristine and original versus what's part of a growing organism. That is, in addition to resisting the search for a single and original, deprecating what is not part of that original, I'm also not looking for what is or is not authentic with respect to forgery. Rather, I want to understand how traditions grow as they are attached to existing collections or works, but also associated with sometimes an earlier protagonist or authoritative figure, or even a tendency, right? Nietzsche talks about tendencies of tragedy or, poetry. To this end, I've written about fan fiction, collaborative writing, right? Foucault and the Bourbaki group, as well as the reworkings of figures into precursors for subsequent writing and innovation and innovative imagination. This is, of course, connected to the search for the single author in a single originary moment. And so the work on pluriformity is especially informed by the Dead Sea Scrolls. Including and incorporating the scrolls into a larger discourse of ancient Judaism and biblical studies into Jewish studies is essential to understanding the development of Jewish thought and philosophy, as well as material philology. By way of identifying the community from Qumran, which self-identifies as the Yachad, I present an explicit challenge against characterizing the Dead Sea Scrolls as sectarian or separated off. An overemphasis on particular so-called sectarian generic categories serves to isolate and interrupt the deep and continuous connections between the world of ancient Judaism and the Greek and Roman world. The challenges raised in my book and in this paper today are intended to create space for a new scriptural vitality, which exhibits creative and innovative possibilities. Thus, Judaism is framed by a past and a future, which is textual, especially, but not only scriptural. And we're going to talk a little bit about traditions beyond the scripture, beyond the text. The scriptures themselves retrospectively create a pattern for the shaping of the law, Torah, nomos, interpretation, midrash, hermeneia, and new conceptual innovations, chidush, that is created through new convergence of cultures in the Hellenistic period. It's also the case that the traditions of scripture carry with them a rich text, a rich past of text, traditions, and cultural convergences. The scriptures I discuss here are more expansive and flexible in this time period than we might mean by Tanakh or Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. The emergence of canon as such, then, is a later development, but in this period, we are seeing scripture and even canon in formation. So here is the Great Psalm Scroll, where we have canonical and what you might not recognize as canonical texts. They're called non-canonical texts, which is itself anachronistic. And then this is, I just want you to take a quick look at this. I'm sorry that it's very hard to see. Can you see it at all? Barely. Okay. It's okay. So it's trust me that it's 4Q70. It's 4Q Jeremiah. Those of you that have a bit of light, and I'm sorry that you can't see it, it's written, there's writing inside and around the fragment, but we'll see other examples like this before the day is over. I want to consider new pathways for thinking about biblical studies and interpretation, for examining these emerging scriptures and their persistent vitality. In doing so, I explore both philosophical and literary discussion. Texts from Jewish antiquity, whether from, I can show this to you here. If we go back, now you can see it a little bit better. Do you see? I want you to just see the writing and overwriting around the text, which we also have on the Great Isaiah Scroll. I'm not going to talk about this at great length. This is just a very cool example of the growth of Jeremianic materials, the Jeremiah not just as a fixed text, but as a text that has a lot of different iterations. But I also want you to see scribal practice not only as copying, but also as intensely creative and innovative. Okay. Anyway, I want to consider new pathways for thinking about biblical studies and interpretation, for examining these emerging scriptures and their persistent vitality. And in doing so, I want to explore both philosophical and literary discussions. Texts from Jewish antiquity, whether from the Hebrew Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or other apocryphal or pseudepigraphic texts, are layered with history, internal as well as external dialogue and revision. The entangled history and hermeneutics embedded within and beyond the Dead Sea Scrolls and related texts elucidate a dynamic conversation of reception, hermeneutics, and innovation. Reception of earlier traditions, and I called this earlier almost first readers. I'm really not thinking about later reception, although that could be interesting. Interpretation and updating of such tradition, as well as the inclusion of new cultural insights and philological innovations through borrowing, influence, poetic creativity. Again, all of this is part of the vitality of which I speak. This is an approach that does not consider the Hellenistic period a lesser or derivative or artificial development of Hebrew, or to be a remnant of concepts and beliefs of ancient Israelite religion. Instead, my focus is on the ways in which scribes, priests, and scholars render the inherited traditions comprehensible. We no doubt already see signs of this development in the Persian period in texts such as Nehemiah 8, Vayikra'u v'sefer b'Torah Elohim miforash v'som seichel vayavinu b'mikra. Here in the text, the scribes and the priests are said to render comprehensible what is read from the scriptures to the community. But one can also see it in a late Hellenistic period, such as Psalm 119, which is overflowing with discussion of insight and wisdom and the understanding of Torah. Here we see an ethic of study of the text for insight and for guidance. Practices of reading for comprehension and the dissemination of knowledge of tradition and scripture in the Hellenistic period are then inextricably linked to practices of reading and of performance of those scriptural traditions. And of course, I'm using the language of performance. I don't have time to really theorize it adequately, but I mean the coming together of orality and writtenness. And I've written about this with Jeffrey Kahn. And what that means. What we have are textual examples, but we have also signals of performed text, which I also think is important when we think about the pluriform nature of liturgy or the pluriform nature of texts. Okay, so there's the performance of the scriptural traditions and interpretations as well, be they commentary, translation, new liturgies, new rituals, all of which build upon and instantiate old rituals, old texts, memory, inheritance. Reading practices thus perform and exemplify the inheritance of earlier textual traditions through explication and interpretation of those texts by this dynamic enlivenment of those traditions in the context of history and culture, and by the communities and writers who are first readers. And I've talked about interpretive community in quite a lot of my work, drawing on Alistair McIntyre and also Stanley Fish. All of these aspects constitute reading, editing, refinement, interpretation, expansion, transmission, and reception. And, the classicists in the room are going to say, oh, that's just, Ars Poetica, right? But it's also ancient Jewish texts. It's also already operating. We can see these practices come to life, even in the absence of grammars, even in the absence of the Masoretes, who will make explicit in the context of conversation with Islam the explicit editing and fixing of text. To read, then, is to perform and to change, but it's also to repeat and to authorize, which is about fixity, of course. So there's this ongoing tension. Reading is part of a larger dynamic that is at once oral and written, past and present, expansive and refining. To inhabit a new text, then, is to create a new context for reading and thinking. Reading a new text can signify the multiple layers of both reading by new readers and rereading by an already practiced reader. I've written I've written in a recent article about P and non-P traditions for the Pentateuchal scholars amongst us, because I think that's also an interpretive process. I don't think it's just about reconstructing sources. It's about understanding practices of reading embedded within a single whole tradition without being a canonical critic. So As has been crystallized in the research of Judith Newman, reading in antiquity can be about liturgy, study, and establishing community. Textual traditions are about reading the past, but not to the exclusion of the present. These texts also participate in the incorporation of new insights from their own present, and these new insights model ways of thinking about their present. Innovations of this kind are of particular importance because of how they exemplify cultural exchange. Time does not permit me. This is Pesach Habakkuk. Not only do you see one of our earliest Pishro, those of you that can read Hebrew, I think most of you can see how its interpretation is marked off on the screen, and the lemma, you can see broken off. It's a very, very, here, see, this is Pishro al, right? Pishro al, right? So you can see the interpretation. But it's also, those of you that know Pesach Habakkuk, Adela Collins once said to me, well, this is not interpretation. That would be like a Hermeneo volume or a green and yellow, right? That can't be like a real commentary, right? But that's what commentary looked like in antiquity, right? It's about activating the political and historical relevance of the text in the context of commentary. It's pretty exciting, actually, and it's very, very beautiful. And you see the markings, right? You see the markings from the scribes all come to life. A whole lecture on Pesach Habakkuk I could actually fill with another hour, but I'm just going to leave this up. I just wanted to show you an example. Okay. So the focus on vitality is part of a larger commitment to rethink the direction of textual work, which of course is relevant to my book, but it's meant to be a programmatic redirection of the field of biblical studies in conversation with classics and in conversation with the ancient Near East, especially Assyriologists who are thinking about some of these traditions as ongoing and creative writing and rewriting. So this focus on vitality for the study of the ancient world, and instead of reconstructing the archetype, here I want to talk about forward-moving gestures that consider the convergence between Hebrew and Greek in a larger interdisciplinary context. To study vitality, then, within the texts of antiquity is to practice a philology that participates in new composition, expansion, and the creation of new texts. I'm just going to let you look at this a little bit while I talk about a different kind of commentary that will excite the classicists, I hope. To study this vitality within the texts of antiquity is to practice a philology that participates in new composition. It was true of the Appendix Virgiliana as a continuation of Virgil's own works, and the Homeric hymns as a continuation of Iliad and Odyssey. So too we can draw analogies to the Mosaic, Jeremianic, Habakkuk, and the didactic or sapiential and liturgical poetic collections. While forward-looking aspects of textual innovation and rewriting and rereading are accepted in classics, in biblical scholarly tradition, I would suggest that this approach is a little bit less common, and this has a great deal to do with canonical strictures, imposition on biblical studies, and I argue that the ongoing growth and expansion of biblical traditions are not a byproduct of studying a text, but rather what sustains the life of textual traditions through interpretive communities. Likewise, as languages come into contact with other languages, and as they are both spoken and written, they dynamically change over time. And here is from the Septuagint. And these shift in languages, these shifts in language are also intertwined with the performance of new reading. These various dynamics are the life and breath of a tradition that have been resilient and consistent. Innovation does not happen at the cost of continuing existing traditions or texts, but rather allows them to persist in new ways. This alternative of a forward-moving philology then embraces the pluriformity of texts and diverse manuscript traditions and textual versions over and against a uniformed archetype, which presupposed rupture and replacement as a one-time occurrence. The term vitality is thereby an essential part of this critique of the history of scholarship, both historicism and Protestant Bible theology, but it's also a proposal that ancient Judaism could be studied as a forward-moving organism through various manifestations of creativity and innovation, so manuscripts, mosaics from En-Gedi, Hukok, Chamat Tiberia, Sepphoris. We see mikvaot, again, very linked to prayer, ritual objects. We see here tefillin and the Nash papyrus, magic bowls, household prayers and items that are very much part of Jewish life, but not only Jewish life, as well as amulets. I argue that Judaism has been throughout its history alive and dynamic to its past and its future. You know, what we're really excited about with respect to Ketef Hinnom, and now I've recently learned since I prepared this slide actually that, you know, Rivka Elitzur Lyman wants to say it's closer to 500 or 400 BC, and there are big debates over how late to date this, but people look at it to see the original or the first expression of Birkat Kohanim, of the priestly blessing. Of course, it's interesting and very, very important for that purpose, but I'm interested in it also as the way in which the priestly blessing will continue to have this pluriform manifestation and find its way in and out of liturgical traditions. In any event, I argue that Judaism has been throughout its history, even its earliest iterations, alive and dynamic to its past, its present, and its future. One cannot draw a singular one-dimensional line from text to translation, from the Persian period to the Hellenistic period, and the interactions across cultural and chronological lines are complex. Texts grow across cultural and linguistic borders between biblical and extra-biblical, between Hebrew and Greek, and they demonstrate ongoing resilience of a recreated past in ways that, as I said already, anticipate the future. So I'm going to pause for a moment. My second project I want to signal is a project that grows out of the Scripture Vitality book, which started in 2017, and it's going to be in the British Museum. This is those students in the room. Just, we have to be very, very patient with our work and with our projects. Nothing happens fast. But in 2030, I'm running an exhibition at the British Museum on the vitality of Judaism, on exile and resilience from the first millennium all the way through the Cairo Geniza, through the medieval period. And this exhibition celebrates the growth and dynamic of ancient Judaism, and it celebrates moments of entanglement, innovative transformation of Judaism in conversation with Islam, with Christianity, with pagan culture, and Persian culture. This is not an argument for influence or direct borrowing of Greek onto Hebrew culture, but rather I prefer to speak about convergences. Moments of convergence between texts allow us to see signs of life, continuity, breath, and memory within new manuscripts of pre-existing texts and in the reception of those texts. I took a bit out of here. In my book, I talk a little bit about the metaphor of entanglement, and I've been in conversation with Gavin Salam, who's a quantum physicist, who uses entanglement, moments of coming together and then splitting apart, and then coming together again. And the reason I appreciate that, or convergence, is we can't talk about ongoing continuity of interaction with traditions. They're interruptions or they're ruptures. Again, I can speak about this more if you like later on. In any event, the collection of biblical traditions in the Hellenistic period is not stable, despite repeated references to the law and the prophets, or in the case of Ben Sira, the law, the prophets, and Ton Alone, other works, which probably includes Ben Sira, but that's a different conversation. In any event, there's a dramatic growth of textual traditions within and well beyond the Hebrew Bible. They're texts that rework earlier biblical narratives as new performance and articulation of a past, such as Deuteronomy, 2 Kings, Chronicles, Jubilees. Others create new liturgies, which develop and build on different categories, previous prayers, collections, and rituals, including texts like Nehemiah 9 or Daniel 9. Still, other texts are legal in character and form, which expand upon earlier Jewish law, such as Jubilees, the rule text from Qumran, and the Temple Scroll. As I mentioned in my introductory section, I don't want to reconstruct historical layers of the text, nor to reconstruct necessarily its earlier part, although that's certainly justifiable. History and composition do provide the focus of this monograph and my work more generally. The emphasis on biblical traditions as unreadable, as is argued by some biblical scholars, or needing to be reconstructed, I don't think attends to the complex literary history, which is part of reading within and beyond biblical traditions. So that's a small critique of a larger discourse with neo-documentarianism for the biblicists in the room. Our texts from biblical and Jewish antiquity have embedded compositional histories that are left transparently at the surface for all to see and engage in a variety of ways. No attempt on the part of the biblical or extra-biblical authors, editors, or compilers is really made to erase the complexity of composite works. Readers are challenged by the text to make sense of contradiction in a way that forces them to inherit multiple traditions. And so to read these texts, even today, is also to participate in the text, in the history of the text, because one must participate in a practice of exegesis as a way of preserving the inconsistencies, the gaps, and the interruptions in the narrative. These inconsistencies, I want to say, are part of the artistry of the text and inherent to their compositional practices. And of course, that sentence is absolutely an homage to Robert Alter. As this says, the texts participate in and is a product of a long and complex history of composition. The overarching goal, then, I think, is to contribute to understanding the whole of a literary work and pave the way to a new hermeneutic for reading biblical narratives. Philology, then, needs to go hand in hand with reading, writing, and editing. I mean by these terms various practices connected to the emergence of new text, nothing less than the history of interpretation. And to adapt Immanuel Kant, historical linguistics without a history of interpretation is empty. History of interpretation without historical linguistics is blind. History of interpretation without linguistics, or more generally, a narrower definition of philology, is blind because it cannot tell what it has before it, what the linguistic uses and abuses are. But philology without the history of interpretation is empty because it's unclear what the significance of linguistic use or abuse is. That is, unless philology is situated within an account of what readers, writers, and editors are doing, of what they're trying to withstand, and of how they are trying to insist on the resistance and persistence of their language and culture. The 20th century Hungarian-German literary critic and philologist Peter Sandy focused on the way a work develops over time and considered the concept of poetic processes. He was interested not in a single originary moment of text or its first expression, but rather he was concerned with ongoing and ever-continuous productivity of a work with respect to its history, philology, and production. He understood the work of the scholar as an intervening reader who continued to produce the text through their own reading. Sandy's conception of philology was also rooted in the future and the past, but he conceptualized philology in light of the presence of collection or a work. This work, he said, is complex and situated within time, but its impact is over time with new and enlivening present through reading. For Sandy, reading is about understanding the interrelational dimensions of a work, but not as a work only of the past, but one that is life-giving to itself through internal conversation and its afterlife as a read and interpreted text. Whereas intertextuality has been taken in biblical studies as a lens through which to examine only a text, indebtedness, or its reception, both of which implies linearity, Sandy's framework allows us to more deeply reconsider the text as both internally complex and as giving rise to complex interaction. Philosophically, much of Sandy's work was devoted to understanding, erkenntnis, and to bridging a past to the future through reading. For Sandy, through scholars' continued interventions, work can be rendered comprehensible and historically contextualized and reread, which adds to a text's vitality. It's my hope that Sandy can help offer biblical studies and intervention into current developments in biblical hermeneutics. Philology needs to be grounded both philologically and also literarily, so one doesn't lose sight of the text in its largest form, as well as its interrelatedness to itself. Once we understand what it is that Sandy means by a work and its wholeness in history and its poetic whole, we can begin to understand what it means to speak of the life or vitality beyond the text, or in other words, how a text perpetuates itself through compositional and growing practices. There are many examples. Some are these additional psalms that are written that are embedded in the collection of psalms, lament traditions that are generative. I'm not just talking about lamentations and Psalm 137, Al Naharot Bavel, but the way in which this is a generative tradition for trauma literature and lament literature. Many examples, but I'll stop with those two. This was an urgent discourse for Peter Sandi, as it was for Gershom Scholem in the 1960s, or Walter Benjamin. For Sandi, the hope of which he spoke when he broke the silence about not speaking about the Shoah and the Nazification of the academy was muted. It was urgent for reasons of destruction and paralysis in the 1960s, following the Second World War. Sandi wrote about Walter Benjamin, Benjamin's new conception of history, which was rooted in the dialectic of future and past, of messianic expectation and remembrance. Adorno may have been right at that time when he said that it would be barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz. But that was immediately after the rupture of the Holocaust. Not only did Adorno come to see that non-barbaric poetry was still possible, but his statement served as a challenge to poetry, which needed to find new forms or new ways of using old forms. We still live with this challenge today, more than half a century later. Sandi was also struggling with these questions, but he did so with a different path. His conception of philology was rooted in the future and the past, but he did so in the presence of a collection or a work. This work is complex and situated within time, but its impact is over time. Reading for Sandi, then, is a wonderful model for understanding, I think, practices of reading in ancient Judaism. Reading for Sandi was about understanding the interrelational dimensions of a work, and this was achieved through the preparation, in his mind, of a critical edition. For him, it was Celan or Holderlin. To study etymology, its relevance to otherness, and ultimately to the legacy of reading again. And I won't read the passage because I've left that up for you, but and I talk about it much more in the book. If we're to understand the authority of Scripture and other religiously privileged corpora, we must seek to understand the generative vitality of these texts then. This is precisely what Sandi is referring to when he signals in that passage a constant or perpetual confronting of a text through understanding. What do we mean then by hermeneutics? Contrary to numerous others, I contend it's not the tendency to read through a model of intertextuality, because intertextuality, as Christeva said multiple times, is not about reading, but rather intertextuality, at least the way in which it's used in biblical studies, and I think often in classes, is a mode of fragmentation. Instead, I want to offer a different answer. I want to study how new integration works in the context of reading, to push back on the impulse to reduce the core of a text or a tradition to its originary moment. And here the impulse to get at the dissected parts of a collection is to unread it or to work against understanding, to atomize our text, to try to find an original or the author's text is not necessarily productive, and it may work against the very practices and perpetuating dimensions about which Sandi speaks. With an eye towards interpretative and linguistic play, then, Scripture, I suggest, rereads itself within the text itself, and then it goes beyond itself, insofar it will continue in the afterlife of the text, through its embeddedness in later writers, through the history of scholarship, through new editions, the discovery of new fragments, engagements, discourses of location, heavenly, earthly, liminal, and cosmic. What's important to this discussion with respect to philology as hermeneutics is that the practices of philology can be used to trace the lines of composition and emerging new readings in scholarly and poetic and philosophical or even theological engagements. Our responsibilities then as scholars are urgent and sensitive. In our times, the work of the philologist must be as mindful of the future as we are of the past. The goal then is not to focus on what is missing from our discipline in the book, but rather to highlight and integrate the contributions of literature and imagination during the Hellenistic period. While scholarship already recognized the contribution of the scrolls to understanding, interpretation, it didn't already really see the larger implications for how Judaism could be understood in this period. Scrolls, as I mentioned, attest to a dramatic transformation of textuality, theology, and practices of reading, which led to new liturgies. I'm going to skip a little bit in light of time so we can have more time for our conversation. Throughout the Greco-Roman period, there were increased expansions and revisions of existing literary and scribal tradition, as well as rich iconic traditions evidenced in ancient Jewish synagogues and manuscript traditions. Vivid depictions of deity, cosmos, monarchy in both material and textual traditions came to life. These are exhibited in a number of different ways, from text to object, from temple to synagogue, from ritual to innovation. And we can see these already. There's a brand new book by Rina Talgam, published by Brill, on the Magdala stone that was found in a Second Temple synagogue in Israel. And here we see just some of it's what's extraordinary. What it's used for is debated. Rina thinks it's some kind of reading platform, like a bima for reading. It's engraved stone in a synagogue with images of temple practice on it, which looks like it's inspired from something between the furniture of Letter of Aristeas to Ezekiel 1 and more, and obviously priestly discourse. Early Jewish mosaics and also the purifying study of spaces across many different sites. I don't think I mentioned this, 14 mikvaot at Qumran. That's a lot of mikvaot in a small little area, if they're all mikvaot, which is also debated, but certainly some of them are mikvaot. I'm not going to talk about the archaeology of them now, but we can talk about them if you want later. In any event, traditions from Greek and Hebrew communities, Greek and Hebrew speaking communities, along with the extant traditions, scrolls, inscriptions, all testify to ongoing innovation, study, teaching, prayer, read and performed aloud, as evidenced in some texts. And we actually looked at some of these examples earlier, where you see scribal thinking out loud, correction and hypercorrection, leaving space for a next generation. I didn't mention this, but the Isaiah scroll seems to be written over generations. So this is written and rewritten, and we're able to do this with the study of ink. And Marcello Fidencio, you can actually see with help of AI, you can see kind of layered additions to the text. In any event, practices of philology are ongoing and profoundly vivid with respect to what we can decipher, restore, and reconstruct. In any event, I came to understand that we could mark changes not only with a single text, but also through text that could participate in what's been called rewriting, or what I prefer to call rearticulation of old or existing traditions. In essence, my critique of biblical studies then came out of the new findings about composition and textual revision that we can trace through the Second Temple period, as well as a vital and dynamic body of information that we were able to gather up in the history of the reception of the biblical materials, of course, in the Cairo Geniza. The scrolls in particular demand that we rethink and challenge the notion of a single archetype, and instead we should be reflecting on the kind of pluriformity that Peter Schaeffer exemplified in his edition of Hechalot. And here I'm thinking also about Grunwald and Haymond in the demonstrated case of Sefer Yetzirah. I'll leave that up for a moment. Sefer Yetzirah is a great example how there was not just a single version out of which any variation, corruption, or error emerged. And in earlier traditions, we've come to understand that pluriformity was really a way of life and breadth of a text, not its indecision or the lack of its earliest layers. But rather, pluriformity challenged us not to think in terms of a fixed text, but rather in an identity of a corpus, which has a great deal of flexibility. And these fluidities allow scholars to trace the creative and dynamic traditions. It's more of Sefer Yetzirah. I've given you a little passage from 4Q instruction here to kind of see how long before Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, we already have a kind of mystical reflection calling upon community to reflect and to meditate, weaving in biblical texts along with a transformation of wisdom or sapiential materials with some key words, Raz, Sod, Pella, Nifla, and the Nistarot. There seems to be a freedom to continue to write, produce, and authorize what we might call new scriptures. So, to understand the ever-flowing waters of hermeneutics, wisdom, practices of commentary and reading, and interpretive motifs that continue to be shared across centuries of reading communities is to understand what I've called forward-moving philology. We see in this dynamic the poetry and philosophy of Jewish antiquity. It is this participation in culture and contribution in the form of dramatic innovation that I want to draw to the forefront of research and investigation. And it's what I've suggested in my book's cover, which I think is perfectly captured in Kandinsky's Black Lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Hindy. That was a breathless tour of scriptural vitality in the Hellenistic period, not the Second Temple period. And yeah, it's just, I feel a little overwhelmed. But maybe conversation will clarify. So yes, I open the floor to any question.
Thank you so much, Hindy. I'm curious in particular about a couple moments when you outlined for us the sort of vision of philology that you're putting forward. Two stuck out. You had a slide that touched on vitality as a component of textual work, which I took you to include our own textual work, and another where you mentioned the participation, philology as participation in the history of composition. So I'm interested to what extent you see contemporary scholars, us doing our own philology as part of these ongoing traditionary processes, as you put them, to what extent we play a role in this vitality. I'm thinking even of Jan Lind's work on creative philology. To what extent ought poesis be a part of philology as you envision it?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to try to answer this in three different ways, but briefly, because I think there are a lot of different questions. What I developed in an article in 2016, I guess it was published in 2017, Ethical Reading, and the way in which I've used it in an ongoing seminar between religious studies and classics with Konstanza Gutenka in Oxford now for a decade, is ethical reading. That is, we had a seminar where we thought about the ethics of textual criticism. And it's, I think you put your finger exactly on that question. What are we doing? What are we imposing? What are we expecting? Stephen Hayworth even came. I mean, some of the more conservative text critics came, and then people that were even more progressive, thinking about what constitutes philology. But how we do that, what we assume, and how we write or rewrite texts, Bentley's Horace or Levine's Leviticus, this is a big challenge for us. It's about the humility of the work of the scholar and what it is that we're reading, which takes me to the second way in which I want to answer the question. Yes, of course, we're doing creative work, but we have to own that. What does it mean, Wissenschaft des Judentums, the science of what it is that we're doing when we're analyzing, cutting up or putting together the different parts, identifying fragments or fragmenting the text. I'm not suggesting that is corrupt or wrong-headed. I'm just asking us, what is it that we're trying to do in our study of ancient culture and religion? And can we learn, and then the third way of answering your question is about composition. Can we learn about how texts were composed in the way that in the book you mentioned earlier, what I argued was that we can learn from Benjamin and the Trauspiel about trauma and loss, but we can also learn about antiquity, about how to think about current trauma in our own world, that we can reciprocally learn from one another. Practices of composition, the most recent piece I just wrote is on the priestly materials, priestly discourse, where you can see reciprocally parts of the priestly Torah, if we want to call it that, or the priestly composition, writing and rewriting itself. It doesn't go in one way, and part of it is because the writing and editing is going on, as we know, not only in the hands of the scribes living in Qumran, but this is what's happening across the Hellenistic period. So compositional practices are ongoing. And can we learn from them about how we trace the practices of composition? By laying out possibilities, pluriform ways of reading, and still be rigorous in our argumentation, right? So it doesn't get, we don't lose the thread. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this fascinating lecture. And so many questions, but I want to ask a version of the same question, which is, I heard some of your arguments as going in the direction of maybe just forgive me if this is simplistic, but blurring the boundary between scholia and text. And I was thinking about the sort of some of the images that you had, and I was thinking in my mind about the sort of Veritas A manuscript of Homer, which is completely surrounded by scholia. And part of what we do is to extract the sort of primary text from the scholia. And so I think some of what you were saying is also complicating this act of extraction from the tradition. And so I'm wondering if this is not, if the original text is not a workable unit, or at least it shouldn't be workable in the same way. The way you were talking about tradition as a unit of analysis. And I was very curious if you, how you think about tradition, how you demarcate traditions as unit of analysis, and whether that's a reflection of the interpretive community, or how do you sort of talk about that relationship?
Yeah,
Thank you.
That's such a great question. I guess I want to answer it just by thinking for a moment about Pesach Habakkuk. I think it's such a great example because it's not reading. We have almost none of Habakkuk amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? I mean, Ron, you'll know exactly how much. It's a tiny, tiny little bit, but we have this text, and this text, the citation, right? The textual citation participates in a number of different textual traditions. So sometimes it looks more like the LXX, sometimes it looks more like the Masoretic text. So this is a textual unit, and this is part of an intellectual community that's thinking about commentary and new text. I mean, in a way, is this another iteration of Habakkuk? And I raise this as a question. I don't mean it as a statement. There's a question mark at the end of my formulation, because we want to think, and part of why I so appreciated your question and the way you formulated it is, how are we to think about these commentary traditions that present themselves, it seems, as not just definitive readings, by the way, not pluriform readings. I mean, one thing a student asked me, we like what you're saying, but it seems when we're reading the scrolls or we're reading some of these Greek writers, they're not really interested in pluriform. It's my way or the highway, right? This is not a very pluriform community that we're talking about, but I'm looking at it as a series of different expressions. But I think to talk about interpretive community, and you've taken it to a step that I haven't gone to, which I really like, this is itself an expression of what Habakkuk is for the Yachad, which may live well beyond the Qumran site, which we know because we know this from Josephus and possibly other sources, but we also know that some of the textual traditions come from outside of Qumran, are not just produced in Qumran. I'll leave it there, but I think the answer is yes. And we want to rethink, one more thing, Duncan. So we want to rethink the way in which Pesach Habakkuk, for example, has been located in the Scholia tradition, as though it somehow solves the problem. I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. To begin a conversation, Duncan was asking earlier, why is the conversation with classics so important to you? And this is why. We need a bigger context. Some of you, there's some Assyriologists in the room or people who work in the Levant. So this new volume of the Babylonian Chronicles and the astrological text that was just produced by Irving Finkel and Catherine Stevens and a few others, they're reading it, but they're reading in the context of ancient Judaism and the classical world, to try to help us think together about how to make sense of the Babylonian Chronicles, for example. And this is exactly the way we need to read Pesach Habakkuk, but also to think about the history of textuality. Yeah, thank you.
My own teacher told me that this was just scholia. This is just like the Greek, but
Right.
that's only part of the story.
Right, and arguably, James has thought about this a lot. This is basically what Barry Hartog has argued, and others have argued. But look, it's Emmanuel Tove, when I was challenging a few years ago the naming of the scrolls, I read an article about nomenclature. How did we name them? Well, we called them by Jewish text, Christian text, mystical text. You found a text that was about secrecy. Oh, you called it Sefer HaRazim, like a later iteration of a mystical tradition. And he said, what else did you expect us to do? he said to me, Emmanuel Tove, who, if you don't know, he's a giant in the field. Like, and I said, I didn't mean to be judgmental, and I really toned it down on my article, the article version. I mean, not because I felt bad, but because I wanted to participate. This goes back to James's question. We're standing on the shoulders of giants, and we're trying to make sense of it. So it's not that Shia Cohn was wrong, or that Barry Hartog was wrong, or that Brownlee was wrong, right? But we're trying to make sense of what it is that we're finding, but we need to be patient with ourselves and with our texts, and also with the field, and to do it slowly and work as philologists, but also to work in the larger context of antiquity. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the present. It's a very nice and a very great one. So mine is a quite need a kind of clarification. You said textual tradition are about reading the past. Oh, indeed, that is 100% correct. Textual tradition, and you link that one at present. It's not exclusion to the present. So you explain a lot. So briefly, what are these? How and what? What are present for us? Such a kind of things. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm just going to stay with Petra Habakkuk because I think it's a great example. It activates a text which is about a previous period in their own political present. So the text is reading. I know you're also asking me a contemporary question. I'm not going to obfuscate, but I think I prefer an ancient space. But we will talk about modernity as well. But texts, so they're reading their past text, and they're making a new present, and they're creating, in this case, almost a messianic or redemptive hope for a new future, right? A future after destruction, or a future that offsets destruction. And that's why Petra Habakkuk is such a great moment about past, future, and present. Here is where I think we need to take responsibility for how and what we do with texts from antiquity, especially when they're charged with religious implications for community. So we just have to think responsibly about how we're reading. First of all, how we criticize ancient texts as if we could take the same kind of political sword against antiquity. And we want to understand it in context, but we also want to be careful about activating those texts in the present. And so I didn't mean to suggest that it's an easy operation. I think in those passages, I'm really trying to describe, perhaps protesting too much, that this is not about a late Judaism that's exhausted, that they can't write texts, so all they do is read texts. They can't do anything new, so all they do is interpret. Or that the period after Josiah's reform, or after the first exile is over, Judaism is over. So this is a response. Not only is textuality not over, but creativity isn't over, and one doesn't have to wait until the medieval period, for new poetry and new possibility. That this is done very much in conversation with Greeks. And with the Babylonian tradition. And Bernd Schipper and others, this big project by Bernd Schipper now in Berlin, has argued that we really need to rethink the relationship between Egypt and Judaism. And, for someone who works in Alexandria, I think it's a pretty compelling narrative, both with respect to Septuagint, but also with respect to figures like Philo of Alexandria, Wisdom of Solomon, and other texts. But I don't think I've adequately answered your question about presentness. I think that's not what this book was about, but I do think that this was a question that a scholar of Rosenzweig asked me recently, Benji Pollack, and he said, for Rosenzweig, this would be active and present, right? And I said, whoa, like I backed off a little bit, but I think I have to be, and actually, if I could just take one more second on this question. Perhaps the best critical question that's been asked about my book yet is by a philosopher named Eli Friedlander, Shaul Friedlander's son. He's a philosopher in Tel Aviv. And he said, Hindy, all this discussion about vitality, chayut in Hebrew, or chiyoniut, he said chayut he preferred. But what about hamata? What about mortality? He said, where is mortality in your book? there's a cheap way to answer the question. I wrote about mortality in the 2014 book that was about death and destruction. This is about life. But it's a very serious question. And it's funny to answer the question about presentness by answering it about mortality. If you have vitality, if you have chayut, you also have hamata. They go hand in hand. And underlying this discourse of vitality, although I've tried to kind of speak to the light and not to the dark as much in this book, is also a very dark underbelly of loss and death and our own mortality. So texts do die, and people die, and our own mortality is about the loss of tradition and the loss of the people we love. And this is something that is not made explicit in the book, except insofar, and this is a personal note, that I was writing this book while my mother was dying. So the dedication is really to her in her very last breath. So I am thinking about it, and that's a very personal point. But I think that if we talk about presentness, we also have to talk about absence. Thank you.
Hindy, thank you so much for a really inspiring talk. I'm going to, in some ways, stick with some of the themes from your last question and answer. So, give you a chance to expand on it. And forgive me, I dabble in rabbinics, but I'm really a modernist. So my questions are, in some ways, from a modernist standpoint, and sort of a three-part question. So I hear, perhaps projecting, a little bit at least in what you've presented here and what the book does, a fierce, in a way, critique of the fear of historicity on the part of the way we orient ourselves toward the authority of these texts in religious settings in the modern period. And I'm wondering whether that's just me projecting or whether you see some of that in what you're doing. Secondly, you talked a lot. I mean, vitality, it's a wonderful category. I can't tell, you noted in response to one of the other questions about how much some of the people that we're referring to are absolutists and they're not pluriform in their thinking, but I got the sense that you feel like there is a self-conscious construction of a vital kind of interpretive community or tradition, that it's not just projecting backwards and saying, look at all the different voices that were going on in this moment, that you see there being a sense, in some ways in a pre-modern world, and certainly in an ancient world, of there's something healthy and there's something vital about a pluriform kind of community. Again, maybe that's a misreading. I would love clarification on that. And that sort of leads into the third part of my question, which is, I think those of us who are critical of this fear of historicity tend to think that fear of historicity is very modern. That it's a Wissenschaft development, it's a wherever we want to situate it, 18th, 19th century. And I guess my question is, you make a wonderful case, part of the contribution of what you do, for the fact that the pre-modern world is as rich and multifaceted and pluriform in a certain way as the time that we know and the places that we know. And so the question is whether or not, how do we make sense of the idea that the modern gets so scared of sort of thinking about pluriformity in texts that become constructed as singular and authoritative later, if we see the pre-modern world as being so vital also?
Yeah. This is where I wished Eric Ruin could come this afternoon, but he had a lecture. He's thinking a lot about how to problematize history and historiography in ancient Judaism. And I think, his critique, is forthcoming in this new monograph, is a very, very important critique, because he doesn't think we can use these ancient Jewish texts to reconstruct history, or that we should even call them history, but rather historiography, very much aligned with the work of someone like Chris Kraus on this question. And I think he's absolutely right. I'm really talking about your last question first. Is it about, one of the critiques that I've offered in a number of different contexts is, don't impose or expect a genre to function in the way we think about it in a modern context, and to allow the texts not to speak for themselves insofar as we're co-opted by a narrative of, I don't know, angels, demons, prophets, but to allow us to understand the way in which the unfolding of time is being presented to us. So it's a way of thinking about time in different ways. To expect the text to help us reconstruct, and this goes to your first question, history as it was, just the facts, Rankian history, or in a kind of obviously a reductionist way. It is a critique I have, but it's for many, many different reasons. One is to dismiss texts as propaganda because we can't use them to study history, or to cherry pick the texts for the purposes of contextualizing it in the ancient Near East, as if that somehow redeems the text because it's either earlier or it's historically grounded, and instead of having this conversation with the cultures with which the biblical texts are written. And that is to absorb and to think about new ways of thinking about history in the context of biblical studies, which is a challenge. This is something that Eric Gruen is working on now, and I think we can take heart from that. Across the last century, there have been very just throwing the Bible away in the name of, well, we can't do history. There is no history here. So and just dismissing everything as super late and super derivative and super irrelevant for history. I'm not saying that, but let's critique. Let's be a little more subtle about what we mean by the reconstruction of a culture and a religion and a life or interpretive communities in conversation with texts and belief systems and rituals. And the middle question is really, really exciting. I don't know. I mean, I'm excited about pluriformity. I mean, one thing you're saying is, why are you so excited about pluriformity? I mean, it seems like super messy, right? Like, you can't teach. I want to just try to teach 5 different versions of a text to a class. It doesn't work. I mean, you can talk about, versions, but you can't actually teach it with meaning. So you still have to teach a version and then maybe complexify it, right? So, I mean, I have different examples in my head of what text I want to kind of put on the table for you. But we can just take the last one because we didn't spend so much time on it. There we go. Yeah. So we think there are different versions. There's 7 copies of this text called 4Q Instruction. It's a text, people thought it was a lot like Ben Sira or Proverbs, right? But there's 7 manuscripts and they're different from each other. So immediately, what did we say? There's one original text and all of these are derivative, right? So I'll give you 3 things that are exciting to me about this. One is we see the way in which scribes, communities, teachers, students are thinking and rethinking the sapiential tradition about secrecy, creation, taking care of your parents and the poor, and being kind of better people so we can fulfill the vision of being a paradigm of holy ones and being able ultimately to sing with angels. I'm just summarizing, 4Q 417 and 4Q 418 for you just for fun, and putting it together with the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice also for fun. But yes, I hear my kids saying fun. Okay, but it's all relative. But to see different versions of a text might be to see a text grow. And James Natty has done this brilliantly with some of the rule texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Is it to reconstruct an original text, or do we see different iterations of a text and see communities thinking and reading in wildly creative ways? And this is something that Irene Perano, the Latinist, has done with the Virgilian corpus. People talked about the additions, and please, classicists amongst you might want to help me out with this, but people have talked about the later materials associated with Virgil as just being derivative. But she wants to integrate it into a conversation, and that's a really exciting moment for me, to think about the way in which these grow. But these also are pluriform manifestations of what to do with a work like Proverbs, wisdom psalms, Ecclesiasticus, Ben Sira, And that's also pluriform. That is, the wisdom traditions are growing and changing over time. And I haven't mentioned law, but law is also dynamic. It's dynamic and it's growing. It's ever growing. It's not just a code that's inscribed. It never was a code inscribed in a monument or a pillar. People who work in ancient law know that it's constantly growing and changing. So I mentioned 3 reasons why I'm excited. One is to see possibly different iterations of a text and to study it not for its best version or its worst version, but to understand how a tradition grows. Number 2 is to see over time a sapiential tradition, for example, can grow over time. And the third, I'll stop there so we can go on to other questions. Thanks.
I knew that the conversation would fizz like this. I'm gonna take a question from myself. It's perhaps a continuation of something that Ethan was getting at, which is this question of the self-consciousness of this kind of vitality. And I was thinking about the letter of Aristeas and the ultimate scene of translation, in which they all go off to the island and they talk a lot. Versus, let's say, the later tradition of the translation of the Septuagint, about 70 scholars kind of divinely in 70 separate spaces, and and all of that kind of thing, and whether you would, and for this instruction text is also kind of hinting at it, how much sort of internal reflection is there on this kind of literary vitality, and how coherent is it, or is it itself kind of pluriform reflections on vitality?
Yeah, so it's, I think, one of the most important questions for our field today. I mean, I would take Duncan's question is really a question about the formation of the subject. And if you want to hear it in terms of Charles Taylor, if you want to hear it in terms of, and Boyarin is one of the people who said that you don't get this in Jewish antiquity. And I've argued against that and said you absolutely get it. But you have to take these exceptional texts seriously. Looking at Aristeas, looking at Philo of Alexandria, looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls, what Boyarin and rabbinicists might call non-normative texts, or texts that aren't part of Rabbi Sharira Gaon's corpus, right? I mean, retrospectively. These texts are showing different ways in which selfhood and subjecthood is thinking out loud about its own, his or her own self, like their own self with respect to ritual practice, to be teleo or shalem, to be perfect, to be better. And here is where repentance, or the possibility of change, metanoia, is part of that shaping. But I wouldn't say it broadly. We wouldn't say it broadly. I would want to really differentiate your question about the letter of Aristeas, which is so interesting. And I mentioned before this brand new book coming out by Max Leventhal. I don't think this is particularly what he's focusing on, but there's a lot to say about particularly what translation is. I mean, we could do this for a very, very long time, just have a seminar on translation, right? What is translation, and what role, and how do we think about translation? For Philo, it's a miracle, and it's another creation of the world. I've written about this a little bit as cultural symbiosis, borrowing from Hermann Cohn to think about ancient translation, waters above and waters below. Exactly, that's where you have to go in order to translate, and then you come up with a perfect translation, versus Aristeas, which you feel like you're in a rabbinic Beit Midrash, right? All the priests come over and they participate and they think and they're like working it through. Or for reasons that have to do with trying to find the word for nature, I've been thinking about medieval translation by Shmuel ibn Tibon, when certain words, strange words, mishunot, are being translated for the first time into Hebrew from the Greek to the Arabic to Hebrew. The work of translation is enormously philosophically and literarily rich and creative and absolutely self-conscious. I think those texts, I think Philo and Aristeas are thinking about it, and the rabbis are absolutely thinking about it. To say that the very worst day, the worst day of the history of Judaism is the translation of the Septuagint, but at the same time to also remember that it was miraculous. Like, how do we hold these two positions together? So that's different, I want to say, from the self-consciousness or subjecthood that I think is reflected in some of these sapiential texts that start to talk about the self, that start to talk about I-ness in the way that Momigliano here in the lectures, right? He did them here, the
No,
Berkeley.
I think those are the Jackson lectures on the biography.
Oh,
at
biography.
Harvard. Yeah.
Yeah, the Harvard one. Sorry, but he also he did a series of different ones. Anyway, so Momigliano, I will defer to you, but Momigliano talked about I-ness and the way in which it emerges with Thucydides, and I think we begin to see I-ness, like selfhood and subjecthood, as an emerging description of practices, especially in the domestication of ritual, right? So you bring ritual home, you bring sacrificial practices home, and the kind of work towards transforming the self through recognizing or acknowledging sin or transformation or acknowledgement, right, in the form of confession or praise, becomes on the subject. So this is a very, very rich question, and I think the answer is yes, but not in a pluriform way. And here, again, we need to look at instruction with a connection with a few other texts, especially the Thanksgiving hymns I've argued in the book, that the subjecthood matter really matters. The translation stuff, I've just scratched the surface, but I think Aristeas is such an interesting question for this topic, and I've not explored Aristeas for vitality. One thing we really have to think about is, what is Philo talking about when he's talking about Philo of Alexandria, when he's saying there are all these different versions of Greek out there, but we're gonna there was a miraculous moment where they became sisters. The Hebrew and the Greek became like perfect sisters, and they perfectly corresponded. This radical reading of that story, where again it's the creation of the world. One could say, well, Philo needed it to be perfect because he's reading and interpreting this text. But that's only part of the story. The fact that it's possible to talk about translation in these terms, and you might be thinking about Luther, or we might be thinking about Buber Rosenzweig, right? The fact that it's possible to talk about translation in these terms, which are inspired, is itself, it brings revelation into what we might call the mundane or the everyday. Yeah.
I almost never think about Luther, but that's okay. Ron, really, as a final question, if that's okay.
I mostly would just want to thank Hindy for this intellectually rich discourse and interaction with us, and we'd love to keep you here. And it makes me think that biblical studies and the Second Temple Judaism has a future in the academy, and that's an exciting thing. And so I just want to thank you for bringing that vitality to us.
A perfect moment to thank you.